Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Anatomy here at Chaminade University. This will begin the semester of 152, and we will jump right in starting with the autonomic nervous system. So this first slide here does a comparison between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Now, the somatic nervous system is responsible for sensory and motor neurons. Basically, it's responsible for detecting everything from the external environment, neurons such as touch, pain, temperature, and what's called proprioception, which is basically how you feel relative to your environment or your sense of self-awareness or self-position. It also is going to involve special senses such as sight, hearing, taste, smell, and equilibrium. Now, this is going to involve motor neurons that innervate skeletal muscles, which are under voluntary control. Now, in contrast, the autonomic nervous system is very different, namely that it is not under voluntary control in that it is involuntary. Also, it's going to be receiving information from internal. So it's going to be getting input from sensory receptors that are located in the organs, in blood vessels, in the muscles, and in the nervous system. Now, these sensations are going to be perceived and then regulated, but on a subconscious level. Now this here is showing the axon of a single somatic motor neuron, and it's going to be found here in the lateral gray horns extending out until it reaches an effector. In this case, this is skeletal muscle. You'll notice that the somatic motor neuron is myelinated, and that it's releasing acetylcholine. You'll also notice that there's only one. So there's one neuron that runs out of the spinal cord all the way along until it reaches its target or effector tissue. And also, additionally, it's going to be releasing the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Now we're going to see several differences between this and what happens when you look at the autonomic nervous system. Now in autonomic motor pathways, they're going to consist of at least two motor neurons in a series. So instead of just having one, like we just saw with our somatic nervous system, we're going to have at least two, sometimes more. And the first is called preganglionic. And now this is going to seem like a big word. Preganglionic and postganglionic literally just mean that they are heading into a ganglion or out of a ganglion. So the first one is preganglionic in that it hasn't reached the ganglion yet, and it still has its cell body in the central nervous system. That means that the cell body of this neuron is going to be found either in the spinal cord or in the brain itself. Now this axon is going to extend out to a ganglion, an autonomic ganglion, so an area where it's going to interact with another neuron. Now a second neuron is going to be present here. This is the postganglionic neuron. And this neuron is unmyelinated. So I may not have mentioned, but the preganglionic neuron is going to have a myelin sheath wrapped around it, whereas the second one is not going to have that myelin sheath. So the axon is going to extend directly from the ganglion to the effector, which could be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland. Now this is showing the different types of ways that information can be passed on. So here we have shown in blue would mean that it's a sympathetic pathway. If it is shown in red, it would mean that it is a parasympathetic pathway. And while we will get to the differences between those in a minute, you can think of this as oversimplified versions of fight or flight and rest and digest, and that they are going to be interacting with the same pathway and with the same organs, but they're going to be interacting in different ways. For example, when you want to increase your heart rate, you want to decrease your digestion, etc. So the top two are going to be sympathetic interactions, and this one is going to be parasympathetic. And they're both going to be autonomic in that we have at least two neurons that are interacting. So here we have a sympathetic preganglionic neuron. That seems like a big word, but sympathetic again just means fight or flight. Preganglionic means that it's just going to be a neuron that is going to be coming into the ganglia. Again, this is going to be myelinated, and you're going to see that here. All of the preganglionic neurons are going to be myelinated. On the other side, they're going to be unmyelinated. Okay. Here we have the autonomic ganglion. And then a sympathetic postganglionic neuron, which is unmyelinated. In this case, it's going to be secreting norepinephrine. Now, norepinephrine and epinephrine you may also recognize as adrenaline. These are going to be uppers that are going to increase or upregulate particular body functions. The effectors of this norepinephrine are going to include things like the glands, your cardiac muscle, which is muscle in your heart, and smooth muscles, such as that found in the uterus and the urinary bladder. Another way that we can have a sympathetic interaction here in this autonomic nervous system is we can have a sympathetic preganglion that is then going to enter into the adrenal medulla. So this here is the adrenal gland. The adrenal glands, which are located on top of the kidneys, have a cortex, which is an outer section, and a medulla, which is an inner section. Anytime you hear cortex and medulla, that always just means outer layer and inner layer. And in the adrenal medulla, these sympathetic preganglionic neurons are going to be releasing acetylcholine, which is then going to cause these chromaffin cells to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. And this is going to be more of a global effect. It's going to affect most of the body because it's going to be entering into the bloodstream and then distributed. So it's not going to be a local effect on one particular organ, but rather it's going to be distributed and have an effect on many organ systems. Now this one on the bottom is a parasympathetic autonomic nervous system setup. So here's a parasympathetic preganglionic neuron. Again, that sounds like a lot, but it just means that it's involved in rest and digest, and it's going to be prior to reaching the ganglion. So the preganglionic neuron here, again, it's myelinated. It's going to reach the autonomic ganglion. Here it's going to release acetylcholine. And then in the parasympathetic pathway, we're going to continue in a parasympathetic postganglionic neuron, which is then going to release acetylcholine, and it can have an effect on things like the glands, the cardiac muscle, and the smooth muscle. So you can see it's going to be the same effectors, but it's a different neurotransmitter, right? The sympathetic pathways can release norepinephrine or epinephrine, and acetylcholine is the only thing that our parasympathetic pathways are going to be releasing. All right. So again, there's multiple different ways that we can dissect the nervous systems, right? So we dissect it into somatic versus autonomic, and then the autonomic is further divided into the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. And while I touched on this previously, now is a moment for me to kind of flesh it out. So the sympathetic nervous system is often referred to fight or flight simply because it leads to things like alertness and increased metabolism so that we're able to be ready for whatever that emergency is. The parasympathetic nervous system is the opposite. It's referred to in rest and digest, and its stimulation slows down most body activity, but is going to increase digestion. This is a comparison of the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems. So the somatic nervous system comes from the external body, right? Somatic senses and special senses from your external environment interpreted internally. The autonomic nervous system is going to have information coming, mainly the sensory input is going to be coming from interoreceptors, or receptors that are inside the body. We do have some that's going to come from somatic senses and special senses. And they're going to be involuntary, and this is a major difference. Somatic nervous system is going to be voluntary. For example, I can reach over and pick up something on the table and choose to move it to another location. So it's under my voluntary control of skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system is under involuntary control, and that involuntary control comes from the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and from the cerebral cortex, going to be flowing through the brainstem and the spinal cord. The motor neuron pathways are also going to differ. As I mentioned previously, the somatic nervous system is a single neuron pathway. The autonomic nervous system is a multiple neurons, usually a 2-neuron pathway, with preganglionic neurons extending from either the central nervous system or the brain, synapting with the postganglionic neurons in what's called an autonomic ganglion. And then those postganglionic neurons, mind you, the preganglionic neurons are going to be myelinated. Postganglionic neurons are not myelinated, and they're going to extend from the ganglionic synapse with the visceral effector. Or the preganglionic neurons could extend from the CNS all the way to synapse with the chromaffin cells and the adrenal medulla, which we spoke about, them releasing norepinephrine into the bloodstream to have more of a global effect. Now, somatic nervous system is going to release only acetylcholine, whereas the autonomic nervous system, being split up into sympathetic and parasympathetic, can release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. Now, the sympathetic postganglionic neurons, that means the second neuron in that pathway under sympathetic control, is going to release norepinephrine. However, all parasympathetic postganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine, similar to the somatic nervous system. So there's some specialty there depending on which pathway it's using and what the effectors are. With the somatic nervous system, the effectors are skeletal muscle, which results in the contraction of the skeletal muscle so you can move things around. With the autonomic nervous system, the effectors are smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glandular tissue. And that's going to have the response of either contraction or relaxation of the muscle, depending on if it's a muscle that you want to increase or decrease, right? Like digestion, you might want to increase during the parasympathetic. And then also it can have an increase or decrease rate of the contraction of the cardiac muscle, meaning that we can have a stronger or faster heart rate. So a stronger heart contraction or a faster heart rate. And we can also have an increase or a decrease of the secretion of whatever glands are being affected. All right, so the autonomic nervous system is split in another way into the preganglionic and the postganglionic motor neurons. Now, the preganglionics motor neurons are going to have a cell body either in the brain or in the spinal cord. That means like where all of the organelles within the cell are, as opposed to the dendrites or the axons, right? So the cell body is that centralized region of the neuron itself. And then the postganglionic cell body is going to be outside, obviously, of the spinal cord, and it's going to be found directly at that autonomic ganglion, which is basically where the pre and the post ganglionic neurons are going to synapse. And then it's going to take that information from that synapse and send it out through its axon to whatever the effector tissue is. Again, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. In the sympathetic division, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are basically going to be found in the lateral horns of the gray matter, and they're found either in the 12 thoracic or the first 2 or 3 lumbar segments. What does that look like? All right, so again, everything in blue is going to be the sympathetic division, and here's where the nerves are going to be coming out of the spinal column themselves. And then they're going to interact at these ganglia regions, which are found on either side of the actual spinal cord. So each of these is called a ganglion. And they can do several things. They can either meet at that ganglia and pass on to an effector tissue. They can meet at that ganglia and go up or down one to pass on to a different effector tissue. They can go all the way through and meet directly at for example, they could meet at the effector tissue directly. So there's a couple of different ways that these neurons are going to be able to pass through to the ganglia, but generally what's going to happen is that they're going to have effects on multiple different body tissues, right? Including the face, right? The eyes, sublingual, submandibular glands, the heart through the cardiac plexus, the lungs through the pulmonary plexus, the liver, gallbladder, bile duct, stomach, spleen, pancreas, small intestines, all of this digestion through the celiac ganglion. And also the adrenocortical ganglion is going to send things down to the adrenal glands, which again, they sit right on top of the kidneys. We also have regions of the lesser splenic nerve and the least splenic nerve, which are also going to feed into the kidneys. And as we get lower, we get the lumbar splenic nerve, which are going to feed into this inferior mesenteric ganglion, which then feeds into control of the intestines, or in this case, the descending colon. At the very bottom here, coming from the lumbar region, we're also going to have the hypogastric plexus, which is responsible both for urination and stimulation of reproductive organs. All right, I know that seemed like a lot, but when we look at what the parasympathetic division is doing, we're going to see that it's actually going to be coming out of different parts of the spinal column. So again, if we go backwards in blue, all of the parasympathetic outlets are going to come from T1 to L3. But if we look at the parasympathetic division, the outlets are going to come from the nuclei of 4 cranial nerves, cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10. Again, those are found in the brainstem. And then also in the lateral gray matter of the sacral segments, the very bottom of the spinal cord, segments 2 through 4. So again, if you remember, this is where all the sympathetic innervation came out. This is where all of the parasympathetic innervation comes out. But I want you to note that these pathways innervate the same organs. So here we have the face, we have the heart, we have the lungs, we have digestive tract, right? We have urination and reproductive stimulation. So they are innervating the same organs, but giving opposite commands from the from the sympathetic commands. So the nerves, again, they're going to come from, these are going to be the cranial nerves. Here's the ocular motor nerve, number 3, meets here at the ciliary ganglion and goes on to do the eye, or to control the eye. The facial nerve, which is going to be nerve 7, it's going to have 2 other ganglions, the submandibular ganglion and the pterygopalatine ganglion, and these are going to be responsible for sublingual and submandibular glands, right? Basically the rest of the face. We also have the otic ganglion from the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is going to be responsible for regulation of some of the glands at the back of the jaw. The vagus nerve is one of the most interesting ones. The vagus nerve is going to innervate all of the inner body organs. It's going to innervate the heart. It innervates the lungs. It innervates all of the digestive tract. And we actually know now that we can regulate the stimulation to the vagus nerve. We can actually control some of the side effects of some of the symptoms that people have when they have something like Crohn's disease or irritable bowel disease or some of these other digestive disorders. It turns out that sometimes, not always, but sometimes what's going wrong is that they have abnormal firing of the vagus nerve, and if we can implant something that can then give the correct firing, we can restore normalcy or closer to normalcy to someone who is suffering from Crohn's disease. As I move down into the pelvic nerves, these are the splenic nerves of the pelvis. These are going to, again, be innervating the lower part of the digestive tract, including the colon and rectum, and as well as the ureter, the urinary bladder, and the genitalia. So as you can see, we are innervating the same organs, but we are doing it from different nervous pathways. All right, so we have two types of autonomic ganglia, as we mentioned, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The sympathetic ganglia are basically going to be the regions where we have synapses between the sympathetic preganglionic and sympathetic postganglionic neurons. And we have two major types of sympathetic ganglia. So we have the trunk ganglia. So I'm going to go back for just a second. I'll show you the sympathetic trunk ganglia. These guys lie in a vertical column right next to the spinal cord. So all of these are considered the trunk ganglia. All right. Now we also have prevertebral ganglia, which are going to lie anterior to the vertebral column and close to large abdominal organs. So we wouldn't have seen that in the previous image. And the prevertebral ganglia are going to allow us to have branching off to other major organs. Now, if you picture that an axon is going to come out of the spinal cord and it then has four options of connection with postganglionic neurons. It can do that by number one, synapsing with a postganglionic neuron in the very first ganglion that it reaches, and then moving about its way. However, as we've seen previously, they can also ascend or descend to synapse with a higher or lower ganglion, or before synapsing, to go in through a higher or lower ganglion before synapsing with the postganglionic neurons. It can also continue without synapsing through the trunk ganglion to end at a prevertebral ganglion and synapse there with postganglionic neurons. And last but not least, it can pass without synapsing through the synthetic trunk ganglion and the prevertebral ganglion, and then extend directly to the adrenal medulla, which, as we then mentioned, will interact with the chromaffin cells, which will then release norepinephrine. All right, so this diagram depicts what the options are if we have a axon here, right? So this axon has the option to either synapse at the first ganglia that it finds at the sympathetic trunk. It can do that, or it can continue on up or down one to synapse at one above or one below within the sympathetic trunk ganglion. It can also continue on without synapsing and then either hit the visceral effector where it'll synapse there, it'll synapse, in this prevertebral ganglion in order to reach the effector. So it can either synapse at the trunk, up or down one in the trunk, at a prevertebral ganglion, which is going to be separate from those trunk ganglia, or last but not least, it can synapse in the adrenal cortex of the adrenal glands, where it's going to release acetylcholine, triggering the chromaffin cells to release norepinephrine. All right, so I know we have a lot going on here in terms of all our different plexes, but we also have plexes in our abdomen and pelvis that are called the major autonomic plexes, and they're generally going to be named after the artery where they're located. So that's going to include the celiac plexus, which is located by the celiac artery, the superior mesenteric plexus, again, superior mesenteric artery, inferior mesenteric plexus, renal plexus, and the hypogastric plexus. So the celiac plexus is going to serve the stomach. The superior mesenteric serves the upper part of the digestive system. Inferior serves the lower part of the digestive system. Renal plexus obviously serves the kidneys, and hypogastric is going to serve, we'll show you in a second, some of the rest of down here, the lower part of the organs. So if we look, we can see again the nervous tissue is in yellow. Here we have our trunk ganglion. Here's our right sympathetic trunk ganglion. Here's our left sympathetic trunk ganglion. Right? We also have specialty regions where we have ganglia that are found along major arteries, like the celiac ganglion here, celiac ganglion and plexus. It's going to service the stomach. We also hear superior mesenteric ganglion and plexus servicing the top or upper part of the digestive system, inferior mesenteric ganglion and plexus servicing the lower part, and then that hypogastric, which is then going to service things like the urinary bladder and the reproductive organs. Okay, so the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic pathway are going to be part of the lateral gray horns, and they're found in all the thoracic segments and the first two lumbar segments. So if you remember nothing else, sympathetic pathways are found in T and in lumbar 1 and 2. We have paired sympathetic trunk ganglia that are going to run alongside the vertebral column. They're going to be anterior, so a little bit further back, and also lateral, and they're going to run along the entire way. We've got 2 cervical, 11 to 12 thoracic, 4 or 5 lumbar, 4 or 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal, which is going to be down at your tailbone. Now, you might say, wait, if we're only going to have nerves coming out at the thoracic and the lumbar sections, how can we have trunk ganglia that are paired for cervical, which is higher, right, and coccygeal, which is lower? And that's because we can ascend one or descend one to be able to innervate those regions, as I mentioned. So that was one of those 4 options for how the neurons are able to interact with each other. Now, the cell bodies of the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons, so in contrast, these are still preganglionic neurons, but they're found in the parasympathetic pathway, and these are going to be located in the brain stem and in the sacral segments of the spinal cord in the lateral gray matter. So there is going to be some cranial parasympathetic outflow that comes from those 4 cranial nerves, and we also have the sacral parasympathetic outflow that extends through the sacral spinal nerves. So unlike the sympathetic division, which is all in one region, thoracic and the 2 lumbar, the parasympathetic is going to be split into the cranial parasympathetic outflow and the sacral parasympathetic outflow. All right, so this is just kind of a simplified view of what's actually happening with the parasympathetic preganglionic neuron. So here's the preganglionic neuron, right? In this case, it's not going to reach the ganglia until it reaches the urinary bladder. Here at the urinary bladder, we're going to have the ganglia itself and then a parasympathetic postganglionic neuron. So after that, it's going to have the effector of this smooth muscle in the urinary bladder. All right, so I've just given you a couple of different ways that we can break this down, but we actually have multiple other ways that we can look at it as well. So based on the transmitter that is being produced and released, the neurotransmitter produced and released, the neurons are going to be considered either cholinergic or adrenergic. Now, either they're producing acetylcholine, which we talked about previously, that would be cholinergic, or they're going to be releasing norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline. We also have heard of it as epinephrine or adrenaline, and that is going to be considered a adrenergic neurons. So cholinergic receptors are going to include 2 different types, nicotinic receptors and muscarinic receptors. Now, this is the difference between an adrenergic and a muscarinic receptor. So a nicotinic receptor is basically going to be one that is going to have acetylcholine fired from a preganglionic neuron or released from a preganglionic neuron, picked up from the dendrites of the postganglionic neuron. And then if it continues on to a neuron that's going to be releasing norepinephrine, that's an adrenergic receptor, right? So the nicotinic receptor is one that's going to be picking up acetylcholine at the actual ganglion. And at the effector cell, if we're releasing norepinephrine, that's an adrenergic receptor picking up norepinephrine here, right there, that receptor. And if it's picking up acetylcholine, then that's called a muscarinic receptor. And one of the ways that you can remember this is because this is something that's going to happen when we have innervation to most sweat glands. And sweat glands can be kind of musky, right? It can cause an increase in sweating. So nicotinic receptors, when we're going to be releasing acetylcholine at the ganglion, and at the postganglionic region where the neuron is going to be innervating the effective cell, it can either be adrenergic because it is releasing norepinephrine, therefore picked up by adrenergic receptors, or muscarinic because it is releasing acetylcholine, which is going to be picked up by the muscarinic receptors in these sweat glands or in different regions of the body, which again helps you to remember musk is muscarinic. If, however, we have a parasympathetic division, not if, this is just an example of a nicotinic receptor, muscarinic receptor in the parasympathetic division. So it'll be very similar. We have acetylcholine released here at the actual ganglion itself, but at the region where the axon is going to interact with the effector cell, we're going to have release of acetylcholine because, again, that's the only way that the parasympathetic division can do it, and that's going to be muscarinic. So only the sympathetic division is going to be able to release norepinephrine. So it can release either norepinephrine or acetylcholine, whereas the parasympathetic division only is going to release acetylcholine. All right, so this is just a difference between the 2 major types of receptors. So we have a cholinergic receptor, right? And that cholinergic receptor is going to be one that's going to be picking up acetylcholine, right? And if it is picking it up in either in the ganglion itself, in the plasma membrane of the postganglionic sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons, i.e. right here or right here, then it's going to be nicotinic, right? Same thing if it's found in the chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla or in the sarcolemma of the skeletal muscle fibers. However, it's going to be considered muscarinic if what's innervated is going to be the parasympathetic postganglionic neurons, also sweat glands that are innervated by the cholinergic sympathetic postganglionic neurons, and skeletal muscle blood vessels. And the effects of this can be variable, right? So if we have excitation here from the nicotinic, that's going to cause impulses in postganglionic neurons. Now, whether we are sympathetic or parasympathetic, either way, an impulse of acetylcholine is going to cause excitation. So either way, parasympathetic or sympathetic, we have that release of ACH picked up by and then causes a trigger, right? And that triggers an action potential, which then causes the release at the other end, either of ACH or norepinephrine if we're talking sympathetic, or under parasympathetic, only acetylcholine. So that excitation is basically going to propagate the nerve impulse in the postganglionic neurons, causing them to fire whatever they're going to fire wherever their effector cells are. In the adrenal medulla, this is going to have the effect of releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine from the chromaffin cells, which again are going to get picked up by the blood supply and have kind of a global effect on the entire body. There will be multiple different effectors, I suppose is what I'm saying. And also the muscarinic effects. So in some receptors we have excitation, in others inhibition, and that's because it depends on which pathway we are trying to hit, right? Are we going for fight or flight, or are we going for rest and digest? It can also result in increased sweating because it increases the effect on the sweat glands, which is how you can remember muscarinic is kind of musky. And then last but not least, it has the effect on skeletal muscle blood vessels by causing them to be inhibited, causing them to relax, and therefore causing vasodilation. All right, so we have multiple different types of adrenergic receptors. We have alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. And these are found in postsynaptic plasma membranes and are generally going to be activated by norepinephrine or epinephrine. Now, alpha 1 is going to be involved in smooth muscle fibers and blood vessels that serve the salivary gland, your skin, your mucous membranes, kidneys, etc. This is going to cause contraction, which is cause vasoconstriction. So the constriction of the blood vessels can cause dilation of the pupil, also causes closing of the sphincters. Alpha 2 is involved in the sweat glands on the palms, smooth muscle fibers in some blood vessels, also can be involved in the pancreas, so it can create create less. So it's going to cause a decreased insulin secretion. So if we have less insulin secreted, that means that we're going to end up with an increased blood glucose level. So all of this is going to be involved in trying to increase the fight or flight response, right? We can also have an increase in the platelet aggregation, so we can cause the platelets to end up being more likely to cause clots or plugs, which might be helpful if we had, say, received an injury, if part of our fight or flight response was in response to an injury, which might need some sort of repair. The beta adrenergic receptor is involved in the cardiac muscle fibers, juxtaglomerular cells of the kidneys, the pituitary gland, and in fat cells. Now, if we can excite this, it's going to increase the cardiac muscle contraction, so increased force and rate of contraction, so you end up with an increased heart rate as well as an increased blood volume per pump. In the cells, we can increase the secretion of renin. In the pituitary, we can end up with the secretion of ADH. Now, we haven't gotten to water balance yet. We'll get to that later in the semester. But ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. And this hormone is very important because it helps you conserve water. So if you think of coffee, if something like that is a diuretic, it makes you use the bathroom, right? You actually secrete more liquid than you did in the volume of coffee that you consumed. So it's a diuretic. You're releasing water. So an antidiuretic hormone will help you retain water, and renin is also involved in a water reabsorption in the kidneys. All right, so B2, so beta 2, is going to be found in the smooth muscle of the airways, in blood vessels that are going to serve the skeletal muscle and the heart, in your adipose tissue and in your liver, as well as some visceral organs like the urinary bladder. It's involved in the muscles of the eye and in the hepatocytes of the liver. Now, inhibition is going to lead to relaxation, which is then going to cause dilation of your airways. So you're going to be able to breathe more. It's also going to be vasodilation, so we're going to be able to get more blood volume through, and relaxation of the organ walls. In the eye, we're going to have relaxation, so inhibition of the ciliary muscles, allowing for relaxation, which I can only assume is involved in visual acuity, so you'll be able to better perceive your surroundings. We also have the hepatocytes in the liver are going to undergo what's called glycogenolysis. So glycogen is going to get broken down into glucose. Lysis meaning breaking, glycogenolysis meaning breakdown of glycogen. It's meaning we're going to end up with an increased blood glucose. Again, we're going to need that glucose as a primary energy source for whatever fight or flight route we have chosen to take at this point. And last but not least, beta 3 is involved in the brown adipose tissue, which has the byproduct of thermogenesis. So as brown adipose tissue is actually broken down, it releases heat. That heat can then be used immediately to drive the creation of more ATP molecules, which can be used in metabolism. So it's basically, again, going to come back down to a short-term burst of energy source. All right, so as a whole, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions are kind of at odds with each other. They're antagonistic to each other. So if one organ system is going to be upregulated during parasympathetic, it's going to be downregulated during the sympathetic activity. And this is basically just showing you a comparison of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So the sympathetic is distributed on wide regions of the body, right? Your skin, your sweat glands, even your erector pili muscles of your hair follicles, things like fat tissue, smooth muscle, blood vessels, etc. You're in most of your body, right? Whereas your parasympathetic is really limited to your head, viscera, of thorax and abdomen, as well as your pelvis and some blood vessels. So it's limited to your abdomen and your head. And that's because the parasympathetic is really just rest and digest. So it doesn't necessarily need to activate skeletal muscle. However, the sympathetic, being fight or flight, needs to have all of the muscle tissue available to it, particularly skeletal muscle, to be able to activate some sort of defense or running away or fighting off in a mug or something like that. Now, the sympathetic preganglionic neurons are going to be found in the lateral gray horns of the spinal segments T1 to L2, whereas the parasympathetic are going to be found on opposite sides of that. Remember we looked at the blue lines versus the red lines? The red lines came out of cranial nerves, nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and then also in the spinal cord segments S2 through S4. In that case, it would be in the lateral gray matter, similar to the lateral gray horns of T1 to L2. The sympathetic has associated ganglia of the sympathetic trunk ganglia and that prevertebral ganglia that we talked about previously, whereas the parasympathetic only has interaction there at the terminal ganglia, where it's right next to the effector cells or the effector organ. The ganglia locations are generally closer to the central nervous system in the sympathetic. That means they're going to be more distant from the visceral effector regions, the organs that they're actually affecting, whereas the parasympathetic, we're going to have the ganglia located very near or within the wall of the effector tissue or the effector organs. Now, axon length and divergence is a little bit different, but not much. Basically, we have preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic that are very short axons, and they synapse to many postganglionic neurons that have long axons, and then they're going to pass on to visceral effectors. Whereas in the parasympathetic, we have preganglionic neurons that have much longer axons, and they usually synapse with multiple, 4 to 5 postganglionic neurons that have short axons, which then pass to a single visceral effector. And this is going to allow us to amplify basically a signal. So if we have synapse with multiple ganglionic neurons that short axons, then we can have multiple different signals pass to the visceral effector from one signal coming out. In the sympathetic division, we're going to have both white and gray rami communicates. We do not have that in the parasympathetic. In the sympathetic, it's worth noting that the white rami are going to have the myelinated preganglionic and unmyelinated postganglionic. For the neurotransmitters is one of our major differences. Remember, the preganglionic neurons can only release acetylcholine, only those two, ACH. Only that one, whereas the sympathetic is able to release norepinephrine as well as acetylcholine. And again, the major thing that I want you to take home here is that the sympathetic division is responsible for fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic is responsible for your rest and digest activities. All right, so on the left we have the visceral effector. That means the target organ that is going to be affected by either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic pathways. Here's the adrenomedulla, right? And in the sympathetic stimulation, the adrenal medulla will secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine via the nicotinic ACH receptors. Now, there is no such innervation for the parasympathetic stimulation in the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal medulla is only responding to the sympathetic stimulation. Now, some things, like the lacrimal ducts, for example, will be able to have responded to both. So there's a slight secretion of tears from the sympathetic, and a secretion of tears can occur from the parasympathetic nervous tissue. The pancreas, for example, we're going to have opposite happens basically. In the sympathetic stimulation, we're going to have an inhibition of digestive enzymes. However, we're going to increase the secretion of the hormone glucagon, which is going to be involved in blood glucose levels. In the parasympathetic division, we're going to have the pancreas secrete digestive enzymes and insulin, both of which have been inhibited by the sympathetic division. So you see they're kind of equal and opposite in some ways, or there's just no contest. For example, the posterior pituitary, the pineal, the sweat gland, the adipose tissue, these are all going to be under effect of the sympathetic stimulation, but have no innervation here on the parasympathetic stimulation pathways. In the liver, sympathetic stimulation is going to convert glycogen into glucose. It's also going to convert non-carbohydrates into glucose and decrease the secretion of bile. What does that mean? That means that we're getting more sugar into our bloodstream by breaking down glycogen into glucose and by creating glucose from non-carbohydrate molecules. And under the parasympathetic stimulation, we are seeing an increase in glycogen creation and also an increase in bile secretion. So you can see that these are equal and opposite. However, the kidney is only under effect of the sympathetic stimulation via secretion of renin. We have no innervation on the parasympathetic. In the cardiac, we're going to see, so in the cardiac muscle, we're going to see equal and opposite. So we'll have an increased heart rate and increased force of your atrial and ventricular contractions under the parasympathetic pathways, under stimulation of the under stimulation of the sympathetic pathways. Under stimulation of the parasympathetic pathways, we have a decrease in the heart rate and a decreased force of atrial contraction. So again, we increase heart rate and blood pressure under sympathetic stimulation, and we decrease heart rate and blood pressure under parasympathetic stimulation. Now, in terms of the some smooth muscle, we have the iris and the ciliary muscles of the eye. So all of these are going to have reactions to sympathetic stimulation, namely the radial muscle will have contraction or dilation of the pupil under sympathetic stimulation, no innervation of the radial muscle for the parasympathetic. However, we will get contraction or constriction of the pupil under the parasympathetic stimulation of the circular muscle when we have no innervation of the sympathetic stimulation. So although we have regions that are innervated and not innervated, you can still see one's a dilation and one's a constriction, right, or contraction. The ciliary muscle of the eye, we can have it relax under sympathetic stimulation so that we can start seeing distant vision. That means we might want to pick up things that are further away under some sort of threat. And that would be the opposite. We'd end up with closer vision or a contraction of the ciliary muscle of the eye under the parasympathetic stimulation. For the lungs, under sympathetic stimulation, we end up with a relaxation, which allows increased airway dilation so we can bring in more air. We will end up with a contraction or airway constriction under parasympathetic stimulation. And in terms of the gallbladder and the ducts, we will end up with a relaxation to facilitate the storage of the bile in the gallbladder as opposed to releasing it into the small intestines, which occurs during parasympathetic, which makes sense because in this case we want to keep it in the gallbladder because we're not digesting. That's sympathetic, whereas release of the bile into the small intestines will be part of digestion, which is part of the rest and digest or parasympathetic responses. All right, I know there's a lot. We're almost done here, or at least with this section. So in terms of the stomach and intestines, the effects of sympathetic stimulation is that we end up with a decreased motility, decreased contraction, and contraction of sphincters. So decreased motility and tone and an increased contraction of the sphincters. And that's because we're going to be slowing down digestion during this time frame. Parasympathetic stimulation will have increased motility. Things will start turning more, increased muscle tone in those regions, and also relaxation of sphincters to allow the digestive process to proceed. The spleen is not going to have any innervation under the parasympathetic pathways, but under the sympathetic pathways, it will contract and discharge of stored blood into general circulation, and that will allow us to increase our blood volume in case where we are going to have to use it to distribute glucose to all of our cells because we're running away from an attacker. The ureter and the urinary bladder are also underneath the sympathetic stimulation. Under sympathetic stimulation, the relaxation of the muscle wall and contraction of internal urethral sphincter can occur. Whereas under parasympathetic stimulation, we can have contraction of the muscular wall and relaxation of internal urethral sphincters, which will lead to urination. So sometimes when you're really stressed out with the sympathetic fight or flight, it might be very difficult to be able to relax enough for urination to occur. There's minimal effect in the uterus of parasympathetic stimulation. However, in non-pregnant women, we have an inhibition of contraction from sympathetic stimulation, but in pregnant women, we can have a promotion of contraction. So that can happen during sympathetic stimulation. So women can end up with a big surge of adrenaline or whatnot that can cause them to promote contraction, which can be a problem if they are preterm. In the males, the sex organs are controlled by sympathetic stimulation, so contraction of the smooth muscle and also the ductus, the prostate, etc. That's all going to result in ejaculation. So this can all happen during sympathetic stimulation. And during parasympathetic stimulation, we can have vasodilation, which can lead to clitoral erection, etc. But it's not necessarily going to be the same pathway that will stimulate ejaculation. Hair follicles are going to be contracted during sympathetic, so we can end up with goosebumps, etc. And we have no innervation of that with the parasympathetic stimulation. All right, so if we look at vascular smooth muscle, and we look specifically at the salivary glands in the arterioles, for example, we can see that we end up with vasoconstriction under the sympathetic stimulation, which is going to decrease salivary secretion, which makes sense because we're decreasing our digestion and increasing fight or flight, whereas the parasympathetic does the opposite. It does vasodilation, which causes increased secretion of saliva. Again, that makes sense too because we're going to start digestion. Same thing with the gastric gland arterioles. We're going to have an inhibition of secretion under the sympathetic and a secretion of gastric and intestinal juices under the parasympathetic stimulation. In the heart arterioles, sympathetic will cause vasodilation and relaxation via B2 or beta 2, but can also cause contraction and vasoconstriction via alpha 1 and alpha 2. I'm not going to go into this or quiz you on any of this, but just be aware that there are multiple different pathways that have effectors from multiple different biomolecules, including the alpha and the beta pathways that we talked about previously. All right, so for most of these, we have very little innervation from the parasympathetic pathway because now we start talking about things like skeletal muscle arterioles, which is going to feed the skeletal muscle, which we're not going to be using in parasympathetic and are mainly using in the sympathetic pathways. Also going to include things like the abdominal visceral arterioles, which are going to get contracted and vasoconstricted during sympathetic stimulation. We'll get slight contraction of our brain arterioles and constriction of our kidney arterioles and our systemic veins as well during our sympathetic stimulation. And again, we have different reactions to different subcategories of the alpha and the beta receptors. So what is the point here? The point is that our autonomic nervous system has a function of maintaining homeostasis. So we want to keep certain body conditions within particular parameters. So certain functions such as heart rate and the force of ventricular contraction and blood pressure, blood vessel diameter, etc., they're all controlled by these autonomic reflex arcs, which basically take information in and make adjustments to be able to get the final result in whatever fine-tuning they need. So the reflex arc has multiple different components. The first is a receptor, which is going to receive that information, be it a barometric receptor, which would receive pressure, or a salinity receptor, which would tell you the salt level, etc. We also have a sensory neuron, which is going to take that information from the receptor into an integrating center, and then that's going to pass information on to motor neurons, which are going to lead outward to whatever the effectors are, the effector organs. Now, the nervous system is mainly associated with maintaining homeostasis. It's associated with all the functions in the body and is intimately involved in making sure that each of these different parameters are met and that therefore we're able to maintain homeostatic conditions from a bunch of different areas. This is the last slide here, and it's just showing the focus of homeostasis and the contribution of nervous systems for all the different body types. And the nervous system is involved in regulation of all of these. So this is just basically letting you know how it's involved in regulation of the integumentary system, skeletal system, muscular system, etc. So I'm going to close here with a thank you very much for listening to my lecture. This will be the very first lecture of 152 for this spring semester. I am looking forward to seeing all of you again coming up shortly. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Aloha.